Welcome everyone to software cost estimating and risk analysis training for our chapter. This is free training we offer every year, like I said. Software has been important for a while and it's becoming increasingly important. It's basically the Internet of Things. Everything is connected to the Internet. I was just reading an article the other day about how people are, their cars are connected to the Internet, and that data is being sold to these data companies, and the data companies are then selling it to the insurance companies, and then people that speed quite a bit, their insurance premiums are going up because the insurance company knows how fast people are driving on the road. So increasingly connected, everything's getting more and more connected. There's even such a thing as smart roads, putting sensors in roads to measure how wet things are and temperatures and things like that. So it's increasingly bigger and bigger part of everything that we do. And even in the hardware, like if you say, well, I don't really need to know how to estimate software because mainly I'm just estimating hardware. But software is becoming an increasingly important part of the hardware to the extent where recently heard that I think it's former Army colonel had described an aircraft, I think it might have been the F-35, said that the hardware for the F-35 was basically just a dust jacket for the software. The software is that important a part of the ability for the plane to fly. So it's becoming increasingly important. And so you can see there some charts there and some graphs about the Internet of Things. Then this is written in the early 80s, so that's over 40, it's 40 years ago now. Augustine, this is a great book. If you haven't read it, I recommend you go out and find a copy. It's not very expensive. Norman Augustine, his Law of the Piranha. Software is like entropy. It's hard to grasp, it weighs nothing, and obeys the second law of thermodynamics. That is, it's always increasing. In the early 80s, he wrote that software, almost non-existent a few decades ago, is rapidly becoming the dominant element. Okay, and we have a separate training module on estimating software because software is different. When you're looking at hardware, you're doing things like weight, the mass, the weight, the power, etc. Not that you go out and buy satellites by the pound like you wouldn't go buy bananas, but there is a strong correlation between those two, and weight is sort of a proxy for scope, something we know early on. Well, the things that you know early on in software is you don't have a weight. There's no weight for software, but you do have things like function points. You have some idea of lines of code, measures of size. Software is personnel intensive. The productivity can vary significantly even within the company. There's really no significant production costs. So one of the things that we'll learn in a later lesson is learning curves. There's no need for a learning curve in software because there's no production costs, basically. And the other thing that's different about software is a diseconomy of size. I think Seebach may call it a diseconomy scale or scope, but it's really diseconomy of size. And what that means, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit, but basically when you look at hardware, there's an economy of size, which is if you double it, the cost less than doubles. If you double the size of it, double the weight, for example, the cost less than doubles. Pretty sometimes significantly less than doubles, and depends on the type of what you're building. The more structural it is, the more the economy of scope. But software is just the opposite. We'll talk about that some more. Okay, software is risky. So it's you look at, and how do we measure, how do we know that there's cost risk and schedule risk out there? We see evidence of that from the historical track record of cost growth and schedule delays. And I wrote a book on risk management a few years ago. There's a link down there below to it. Hopefully that funny link still works. But you can find it on Amazon. But if you look at, so for example, software IT in particular, then this is a chart from a book. You see that the average cost growth is around 50%, 8 out of 10 projects experience cost growth, and the amount of projects that double in cost from the initial plan cost is 25%, 1 out of 4. Average schedule delays are even longer, and 9 out of 10 projects experience a schedule delay for software and IT projects. And one of the things that I had looked at when I first drafted this book and was trying to get it published, I had written it from a defense and aerospace point of view, because that's my experiences, NASA and DoD. And one of the conditions, the primary condition that my publisher, McGraw-Hill, had in publishing the book was I had to broaden it to consider all types of projects. So it just happened to be a time when, in 2020, that's when I kind of family and I, we didn't go anywhere for about 10 weeks. And during that time, I rewrote my draft and submitted my draft to get published. But and one thing I looked at was, well, you see cost growth, you see schedule growth in all types of projects. It's very common. And NASA and the DoD look at hard projects is pretty much middle of the road. Software is worse to some extent. Schedule growth is worse. The frequency of doubling is worse. So this is very, very common. It's very frequent. It's very high, and it can be quite extreme. So, in terms of software IT projects, 1 out of 4 more than doubles in cost initial plans. Okay, so that just motivates the need to look at software and do a good job of estimating software, because it's pretty risky. So we need to do a good job of planning for it up front. So let's look at some of the definitions that we need to know, some of the nomenclature we need for doing software cost estimating. And one of these is SLOC, software lines of code. It's a unit of software size measurement, includes executable instructions and data declarations. Also called delivered source lines of code. But now there's also, when you develop software, sometimes you reuse code, and basically it's pre-existing code, and you use it and you don't modify it. And sometimes you adapt it. You take pre-existing code and you modify it, you redesign it, recode it, retest it. So there's 3 types of that. There's newly developed lines of code, there's reused code, adapted code, and equivalent source lines of code takes into account the fact that, well, if you just reuse code, you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. So you don't get, it's not equivalent to a brand new line of code, and so it's just partial credit for it. So if you look at that, so you kind of take that into account when you look at estimating software. You don't look at just the raw lines of code. You look at equivalent source lines of code. Case lock is thousands of source lines of code. COCOMO stands for the constructive cost model. It's basically it's a publicly available tool that was developed by Dr. Barry Beam of the University of Southern California. It's been updated since then. It was developed around 50 years ago, and it's been updated since then. Function points is the software sizing via quantifying the information functionality, the inputs, outputs, files, etc. How many different functions, how many different things does it interact with? Object points is a way of sizing software by counting. There's also something called the capability maturity model integration, which is CMMI. It's a process level. So organizations, things like organizations like Boeing and Raytheon, they try to have a high level. So it helps them to give the government confidence that they know what they're doing when it comes to developing software, and it helps them win contracts. Okay, and then let's talk a little bit about some definitions that you need. So these are some of the types of software developments. One of the earliest types, if someone has an open mic, you can put someone mute. So one of the oldest is called waterfall, and basically you develop some software, and then you deliver something, and then you develop something else, and it's similar to incremental. And that incremental is something that's often used in spiral, incremental, waterfall. They're all sort of similar. The spiral is the pro in the spiral is it does multiple software prototypes. It helps burn down risk, and it helps get stakeholders involved. So spiral, has some advantages over incremental. Incremental is a little better than waterfall. And then agile which is kind of a buzzword. It's been a buzzword for a while. It's quick deliveries of work code. There are you can measure the size of agile by things things like story points, things like that. It may not necessarily line up to lines of code per se. You do things in small chunks called sprints. It's a buzzword. Sometimes they try to force fit it into places where it doesn't work, but it does. The variety of opinions about it, it often is better in many cases. It has the potential to reduce cost, and particularly has the potential to reduce risk. And that's some people say that agile, the biggest advantage of agile has potential to reduce risk. So I won't go through every single one of those items in there, but you can read that on your own. And this is the V of software system engineering. You start with concept planning, you drill down to the details, and then you test and you get your way back up to the final output. So there's different milestones. This is kind of a DoD type chart. SRR, SDR, PDR, CDR. NASA and other organizations have different milestone names for some of these things. So I'm not going to read this chart either, but I'll go to the next chart. And this is kind of how does hardware and software development kind of, how do they work? You know, what's sort of similar. You know, you start in hardware, you start with hardware requirements analysis, and then you develop a preliminary design, and you go through a preliminary design review. Software, you analyze the requirements for software, you come up with a preliminary design, you go through an SSR, a software specification review. For both hardware and software, you do a detailed design, and then once you have your detailed design complete, you go through a critical design review. And then in hardware, once past that point, you start building hardware. So the equivalent of that software is to code and do testing. And then you start doing more and more testing, and you start integrating it. You go through additional milestones, and finally you complete it. Okay, and then this is the CMMI maturity levels we talked about earlier. There's levels 1 through 5. Level 1 is you don't really have any defined capability. It's pretty unpredictable. Level 2, you're starting to get a little better. You're characterizing processes. It's more reactive though. Level 3 is more proactive, and then level 4, you're starting to measure and control the processes, and then level 5, you kind of got it under control, the process under control. Now you're just focusing on improving processes. Let's go on to we talk about source lines of code. Now, what does source lines of code include? So if you've ever written software, you know that you have you have things that you execute. You have lines of code that you execute. Then you have things that are things like comments. You comment. Hopefully, you will comment your code, your writing code, to make it easy for other people to use and make it easy for yourself to go back and put back up and use. So source lines of code does not include comments. Doesn't include blanks. Doesn't include continuation lines. And it's something that you need to estimate up front. And one way to estimate that up front is by analogy. Say, okay, what is this software like that we've done in the past, and how many lines of code did that require? Some of the advantages are it's widely used, it's easily counted. There's some discrepancies. It's language dependent, right? So if you're using Python, and you're writing the same program in Python, and then you go and you write the same program in C++, your lines of code will likely be different. You probably will have, you might have fewer lines of code in Python than you would in C++, but Python can be somewhat verbose. So it can be driven by language choices. And it doesn't really account for COTS-based systems. COTS stands for commercial off the shelf. And so that's where you, many times, it's appealing. It looks appealing to go out and buy software off the shelf and then just adapt it for what you need. But that can be very expensive because sometimes it's really hard to adapt for what you need. And given that it's off the shelf, it's a black box. You can't really change the software. And so it does have a lot of disadvantages. But the main COTS just has a lot of challenges. But the main thing about COTS is you can't really you don't know how many lines of code they used. And so how do you analyze the cost of COTS-based systems? Okay, and this is from the cost estimating body of knowledge. And so if you're serious about taking the exam, I recommend that you become an ICEAA member. If you're an ICEAA member, you have access to the cost estimating body of knowledge directly online. through the ICEAA website. I think this version 2.0 is currently in beta, and ICEAA is continually working on improving that. Next slide. The ESLOC software is a mix of new and used reuse code. You have reuse, which requires no modification or test, and adapted code. Typically, even if you reuse code, you will still have to wind up checking it, making sure it works. It depends on your appetite for risk. So, for example, when they developed and when they upgraded the software for the space shuttle, they had to make sure it was completely error-free. And so that took a long time, and it took a lot of work. And I know some people that actually worked on that over the years, and they would have to spend some long nights at work going through that because they had to trace through every single potential path the software could come down through it and get to. And so, even if the code was reused, they still had to retest every single line and every single branch. Like give an if statement. You can, if this happens, you do one thing. If this condition, other condition is not true, you do something else. They'd have to go through and have to trace the logic through and make sure that there were no errors either way. So it just depends. If other organizations are willing to take more risks, sometimes if you're looking at certain software, it's possible to fix it even after it's been deployed, even on satellites and spacecraft. So sometimes they're willing to take on more risk if it doesn't involve human life, particularly. The adapted code, there's some amount of redesign, maybe recoding, maybe retesting. It could be major or minor reworks. Now, this is kind of becoming less and less true. Software estimating models are usually based on new lines of developed code. So when they use, SLOC as the driver, then it's usually based on new lines of developed code. That's why we calculate the equivalent source lines of code. So equivalent amount of code if you have to redevelop it from scratch from the beginning. So, for example, if you want to compute, here's just an exercise. This is question 4 in the CBOC module. 50,000 lines of code, 60% design, 20% code, 20% test. 50% is adapted from previous effort, requiring 20% redesign, 100% recode, and 100% retest. 25% is new, 25% is reused. Go through the exercise of calculating that. We won't work through the exercise here, but you can go through the exercise and try that out, see what you get. Now, if you want to do function point counting instead, this considers the number of functions being developed. It's based on the requirement specification. The functions include external inputs, user inputs that provide data, external outputs, like you're outputting to users, like a report, a screen, an error message, external inquiries, which is data that's sent to other applications, internal logic files, which is online input that results in a software response, and external interface files, machine readable interfaces used to transmit information to another system, such as disks and tapes. The functions are weighted for complexity, and the total count suggested for the impact of 14 different factors. So it can be a little bit complicated, but there are some quick function point methods that have been adapted for use in different departments of defense, and make it a little easier, because it can be pretty complicated. It's more complicated than ESLOC, right? I mean, you can see how much, you have 14 factors versus just calculating reused, adapted, and new lines of code. So the advantage of the function points is you can do it early in the development effort, because you basically what it's going to look like based on the requirements, and it is independent of what language. It doesn't matter if you're using Python or R or C or C++. The disadvantages can be subjective. So ESLOC is, even though you do have potentially some judgment on what's reused, what's adapted, what's new, it is an objective measure. Another disadvantage is it doesn't capture the non-functional requirements, how the software must perform, on the constraints, how it will be built. And we talk about estimating methods. This applies to hardware and to software as well. So early in a program's lifecycle, they call material solution analysis, you use a mix of analogy and parametric. Analogy is just finding something similar that you've done in the past. So, we recently developed a similar piece of software, it costs $1 million. We think it's going to be very similar. So our estimate is $1 million. Right. So that's an analogy estimate. Now, typically what happens is you make some adjustments to that, but that's just the simplest kind. You just say, okay, well, it was like this, that costs that much. It ought to cost $2 million this time. Parametric is when you start doing some statistical analysis, developing some cost estimating relationships. You take multiple historical data points, multiple historical analogies, and develop what are called CERs. And then as you get more and more into the details, you just call it engineering buildup, which you take a work breakdown structure and you can look at what are the labor rates, how much time is it taking people, and you can build up the estimate from that. For software, there won't be necessarily material involved, but you would have time and labor rates involved. You can do an engineering buildup that way. And then once you get into the operations and support phase, and the software, there's no production and deployment, there's deployment, but there's no production. But once you get in the operations support phase, and you tend to, there's some tendency to start doing extrapolation, which is just taking what you've done in the past. So, what I did last month cost $100,000 last month to maintain the software. Well, next month it's going to cost $100,000. Just extrapolating forward. You can also potentially look at trends. It could be that you're early in deployment. There could be some bugs probably that we've worked out. So there may be a bathtub curve, and those operations costs and sustainment costs may decrease over time for a while until it reaches a steady state. And then you may have to do some additional upgrades, things like that. And you kind of, things will change. Okay, we talked about earlier about the diseconomies of size. So software effort is A times size raised to the E. This is what's called a power equation. It's a nonlinear relationship most of the time, unless E is 1. E is 1, the relationship is linear. This is constant returns to size. When E is less than 1, it's nonlinear. You have economies of size. As the size doubles, the effort increases by less than double. But when E is greater than 1, you have diseconomies of size. As size increases, effort increases at an increasing rate. Software exhibits diseconomies of size. There's been some different studies done on this over time. There's an Army study that estimated E to be 1.21 for embedded software projects. And research by Barry Beam. Remember, Barry Beam is the father of COCOMO, the constructive cost model for software. He did some research. He published a book on software engineering economics. He indicates, his research indicates that it ranges from 0.9 to 1.2. His kind of his average default value. In the absence of any information, he just could use 1.1. So that's from the cost estimating body of knowledge. It's also from the software cost estimating body of knowledge. There's ICEAA has developed not only a cost estimating body of knowledge, but recently they developed a software cost estimating body of knowledge, and they developed a software cost estimating certification that you can get in addition to a certified cost estimator analyst designation. Okay, the development schedule, lifecycle support, you have technology, exploration, constant development, and transition. Proof of principle, which can take years to develop software, and years to develop the technology, to do the initial technology works. System development, 2 to 5 years. Sustainment, 8 to 15 years, can be even longer. I mean, they're still sustaining and operating systems that they used in World War II. And then phase out. So this is kind of some of the life cycle phases. And then down here, you kind of see where software plays into that. Software quality assurance, non-specific system support tools, those kinds of things. Okay, here's a limited survey of some different software cost models. There's Probe, proxy-based estimating, which was developed at the Carnegie Mellon Institute. It's basically estimating by analogy. There's COCOMO 2. Barry Beam originally developed COCOMO, and Barry Beam, and I think Dr. Brad Clark worked on COCOMO 2. So that's out there. It's publicly available. NASA has developed some tools. NASA has a tool called ASCOT, an analogy software cost tool that uses k-nearest neighbors algorithm to find the most similar historical analogs and estimates that way. And then there are commercial tools that you can pay for, such as one of those is SearSim. There are two primary different hardware estimating tools that are out there. The two primary ones are called SEER, Super Hardware, and there's something called Price True Planning. And they're very similar. JPL, we use both of them, and they're kind of like it's kind of like Pepsi and Coke. They're very similar to one another. But Gallup also has a dedicated software module. They're different standalone tools, software sim, and you can do software estimating and price true planning, but it's within, it's aligned within the WBS. It's not as elaborate. SearSim is a little bit more elaborate model. It also includes maintenance model, defects estimation, does analogy-based estimating, all sorts of things. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of flavor of what is happening in SearSim, it looks at size, how much software it can produce. It can do function points, but really I think the true engine of it is really based around software lines of code. That's its history. Complexity, how difficult is it to produce the software? What's the technology? And then what constraints? What kind of staffing? What kind of schedule? What kind of capabilities do the analysts have? Those sorts of things. And here's from the basic structure. You have some parameters. You have quite a few parameters that give you the effective size, effective complexity, effective technology. Then there's some things in the green cylinder there, the Sears-Smith equations that are not publicly available, sort of a black box. And it gives you estimated effort, how long it's going to take, what the staffing plan will look like, and other things. Okay, software maintenance. Software doesn't degrade or wear out like hardware. Use will uncover bugs that have not been addressed in testing. There's always going to be bugs in software. And especially when you introduce software in your environment, software may break. A famous example of this was there was an upgrade to the European Space Agency's, one of their primary launch vehicles on the Ariane 4, I think, in the mid-90s. The Ariane 4 software was basically used when they upgraded Ariane 4, I believe, to Ariane 5. And when they upgraded from Ariane 4 to Ariane 5, they said, well, we just reuse the software. It's so similar. We don't really need to retest it. We don't really need to do much with it. We just reuse it as is. And so one of the first launches of the Ariane 5, there was a software bug that was encountered because the operating environment was just a little different than what was in Ariane 4. It was a bug that could have affected Ariane 4, but it didn't have the same environment. So once it flew in the new Ariane 5 environment, there was an overflow error, basically where you work with the computer sometimes. Well, you don't see this as much anymore, but sometimes you exceed the limit in terms of things that can be added. And it reaches a limit, it overflows. And that caused the range safety system to be issued to send out a signal to destroy the rocket because it started veering off course because of this overflow issue. So it blew up. So they had to do a huge investigation to figure out what happened and to stop flying this vehicle for a while. And they eventually figured out that it was due to the software. And when introducing a new environment, the software did break. Happens with hardware too, but in this case, software may break when you put in a new environment. Software maintenance includes things like corrective, fixes defects, adaptive, changes in the environment. So what they should have done probably when they were designing Ariane 5 is look at what the change in the environment was and adapting the software. Maybe they would have found the bug that was in the Ariane 4, and then perfective, making it better, making the software better, extending the capability of the software. Software maintenance can be thought as a mini development when additional capabilities added. Cheryl Jones with the Army has done a lot of work in developing and collecting data and developing cost models for software maintenance. And there's a little bit more to it than just linear extrapolation. You can develop some pretty good sophisticated CERs based on things like what is the capability, what are the some of those things. So a software project development is expected to take 47 labor months. It's a little question here. It says question 11 in the CBOC software development. Contractor currently has staffing of 3 developers. The customer will like the effort completed in 12 months. If the contractor uses the following estimating relationship, so this is a schedule estimating relationship, an SER, will the contractor be able to deliver? So you've got three fully qualified developers, and they're going to work 47 months. So if I just do this on my calculator, so we have 3 people, and they're each working 47 months. That's 231 labor months. So 231 labor months raised to the 0.32 is 5.7, and multiplied by that 3.67. So I get around 21 months. So you think, so the schedule estimation says on average, so typically these CERs will produce an average, or average can be a mean value, or it could be a median value, 50th percentile. Half of them be greater than that, half be less. So given that the average, or this is a mean or median, that the average is 21 months, do you think it's very likely that you'll be able to deliver in 12 months? The answer is no. So it's not realistic, right? How many labor months are required for this software development effort? So if you have labor months is A times size times the product technical factors. So you can go through and calculate that out. For the interest of time for this class, I'm not going to calculate it, but it is question 13 in the CBOC software module. So I recommend you try that out, see what you can get. And then if you want to check answers, you can send me an email after this and we can talk about it. Okay, so this is the backup for the software. If you want to learn, and this is also a good place to learn more about software cost estimating. Missile Defense Agency developed a software cost estimating handbook in February. It's publicly available. So if you are interested, I can send you a copy. It's a Word document. It's very good. It's got a lot of good rules of thumb, a lot of good information in it. It's written primarily by Dan Strickland, who is a true subject matter expert on software cost estimating. There are some various software engineering centers of excellence in the United States: USC, University of Southern California, Carnegie Mellon, and then here in Huntsville, the U.S. Army has done quite a bit of work. The S3I, and some other things we can look at for software engineering. The CBOC has a software cost estimating module. They also now have a dedicated software estimating body of knowledge. And the GAO has a cost estimating analysis assessment guide. There's one from 2009. This is a little bit out of date. They did another one in, I think, 2020, and you can find it on the web. You just look up, if you just Google Government Accountability Office cost guide, you can find the latest one online for free. Several hundred pages document. Office of Management Budget has some circulars, and IEEE has document 12207 if you want to learn more about software estimating. And then this is some of the capabilities of the Army S3 here in Huntsville. Okay. And there's some different sources. So if you're interested in this, any sources we can get that for you. A lot of them you find online. Okay, and then I'm not going to go through this, but or this. This is kind of staffing time. If you want to try to do things too quick, it's going to be very expensive. If you take too long, it's going to be very expensive because you have a certain number of staff on, so many people on staff, and you're going to keep charging no matter what. So there's kind of a sweet spot. We've talked a little bit about cost estimating stages, and this is this is some good information about how much of the cost is spent in different times. A little bit more about Kokomo, and a little bit more about Kokomo, and this is some equations in Kokomo. I'm just going to kind of glide through this pretty quickly because we also need to go into risk. I'm not going to go through the detail, but you can look into that. Kokomo is publicly available, so it's quite a few different drivers that you can look at, different complexity factors that are multiplied. And I'm not going to spend a lot more time on that, but also you can do risk analysis on Kokomo. And that's it for software. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and see. Okay, so we got some people into. Are there any questions at this point before we go on to risk analysis? Okay. Um, let's see. Share my screen. Let's go on to risk analysis. Let's see. Let me close this out. Okay. Share my screen. Can everyone see my screen? Yes, sir. Okay. Okay. Okay.
Yes,
Now we're
sir.
talking about risk. Okay. Okay. Now we're talking about risk. So there's two different kind of schools of risk that we'll talk about, kind of broadly categorized. And I'm going to come up with a couple of definitions. There are a variety of different definitions for risk. So, but what we're going to use for this is something that I took from Paul Garvey's book on cost risk analysis. Uncertainty is the indefiniteness about an outcome. It's just we don't know what it's going to be with certainty. We don't know it's going to be for sure. 100% outcome. We don't know. It's sunny outside right now, but maybe it's going to rain tonight. Maybe it's not going to rain. There's some uncertainty. If you look at the forecast, it says very small chance of rain, but there is some chance. Risk is the chance and consequence of bad events. So uncertainty includes both the good and the bad events. So, for example, you get a check in the mail because there's been a class action lawsuit against Verizon, and you're a Verizon customer, and that was something you weren't expecting. But it's another $50, and so it's a good thing, right? It was uncertain that you would get that, but it was a good thing. It wasn't a risk. It wasn't an outcome of a risk. It wasn't something that bad that could happen. Risk is the bad things, right? So you have an unexpected car wreck or things like that. Those the chance of that happening is a risk. So there's two different schools of thought about risk, and the economics looks at theoretical risk management. If you study economics in college, there's a lot of discussions about utility theory, things that you can measure, things you can't measure. Days all the way back to John Maynard Keynes and Frank Knight in the 1920s. And there's a modern diverse group of people that kind of still follow that school. Jean-Jacques Lafont, Nassim Taleb, the Black Swan, John K. Mervyn King, who really try to focus a lot on, well, we can't really, there's a lot of uncertainties and a lot of risks that we can't measure. So it's kind of difficult to do risk management. But I'm focused on the other school of thought, which is the engineering side, which is practical risk management. The focus is on quantitative techniques and trying to quantify risk. We're not going to do a perfect job of analyzing risk and assessing risk, but it gives us a lot of information, and it's a lot better than having no idea what the risk is. So this dates all the way back to Charles Hitch of the Rand Corporation and Stephen Sobel of Mitre Corporation. They developed ways to actually analyze risk. Stephen Sobel did some of the first Monte Carlo simulations of risk analysis. And so that's a group that includes Steve Bookstall work in this area, Paul Garvey, Douglas Hubbard, and I've done some work in this area as well. Done quite a bit of work, research on risk analysis. Okay, risk, another four-letter word. Risk uncertainty is often treated as though it's something to be avoided. We're often blind to risk. The attitude of many project managers is like that of the captain of the Titanic, who said before that ship's voyage, he said, "I've never been in an accident of any sort worth speaking about. I never saw a wreck, and I've never been wrecked." And then what happened? The Titanic occurred. So in the same way, cost and schedule risk are underappreciated. So about almost 7 years ago, I heard a former NASA senior leader say, he was actually the acting director for NASA at that time. It was between political appointees when Michael Griffin had stepped down and before the next NASA director took his place. He said, once a project is complete, no one remembers how much it cost or how long it took. All remembers whether or not it worked. So that's important because it's important to get things to work, but by not focusing also on what things cost and how long they take, it leads to spending more, doing less, and things taking longer. And that is very, that's very important. It has a lot of impacts, especially in the area of national security. It also has something to do with the planning fallacy, which was noted by the psychologist, by Daniel Kahneman and I think Amos Tversky, working together. People tend to plan for the best case possible. So if you plan on a vacation, if you're driving somewhere, you never really, okay, it's going to take us 2 hours to get to something. You don't plan for any slowdowns. You don't plan for there being a wreck on the way. You don't plan for the bad events. You only plan for the best. People tend to have an innate tendency to plan for the best case possible, and that leads to a systematic underestimation of cost, schedule, and risks of those things increasing. We saw this chart in the previous training, so I won't spend too much time on this. It's just to say that, when I was writing my book, I had to look at all types of industries. And one of the things I thought was really interesting was that NASA and the Department of Defense, those kinds of missions are neither the least risky mission, which tend to be things like roads, which you think, well, that's relatively simple, to the most risky were the Olympics. So NASA and the DoD were kind of the middle of the road. The Olympics tends to have significant cost increases for a variety of reasons: international participation, a fixed schedule. And when I read this chart, you look at this chart, there's the average schedule delay for Olympics is 0%. The frequency of schedule delay was 0 to 10. So when I was putting this chart together in March and April of 2020, there had never been a schedule delay for Olympics before. But guess what happened in 2020? There was a schedule delay in the Olympics, and they had to delay the Olympics a year. They were playing for Tokyo. They were playing for Tokyo that summer, and they wound up being delayed another year to 2021. That never happened before. Costs of scheduling are frequent, they're high, and they're extreme. And we talked about that before. And why do these things occur? Why do costs of schedule growth occur? There's numerous reasons. Optimism. I consider optimism to be the original sin of project management. It's an innate bias. We talked about the planning fallacy. Another thing that Common University talked about was prospect theory, which is that if you're faced with a loss, you tend to be more risk-seeking than you're faced with a potential gain. So, for example, if you had some medical thing that would require you to potentially lose a limb with certainty, or you can take a gamble and you could not lose a limb with 50% chance, or you potentially could lose 2 limbs with some percentage, even if the overall average outcome was worse. By taking the gamble, people tend to take the gamble. And project management is kind of the same thing. That costs for government programs is, since these entities won't go out of business, but additional cost is painful to these project managers. And so faced with potential additional cost, they'll kind of take a gamble on costing less. Cost, schedule, and technical misalignment, like a three-legged stool, all have to be consistent in order for the project to balance. There's something called Moore's Law, which has been around for about 50 years, and people keep talking about it going away, but it hasn't completely dissipated yet, which is that technology is growing at an exponential pace. And if you combine that with NASA and aerospace and Department of projects that can take a decade or longer to complete, you're either faced with trying to constantly change update requirements, constantly chase new technologies, or potentially deliver something that's obsolete. There are things like black swans, which are unpredictable, rare, unprecedented events that have a huge impact. Things like World War I, a negative black swan. A positive black swan is often been cited the advent of the smartphone, which has made communications much easier in some ways. That was kind of unforeseen. Lake Wobegon, there's Lake Wobegon effect too. Which is that people seem to think that their team and their group is above average. Well, not everybody can be above average. And Lake Wobegon was a fictional hometown of Garrison Keillor, who had a radio show, Prairie Home Companion, talked about Lake Wobegon. He said all the children were above average in Lake Wobegon. So he, unfortunately, unlike Lake Wobegon's children, not all projects, not all project staff, and not all project managers can be above average. But optimism, we could just control optimism, that would help a lot. And one of the things that the Office of the Secretary of Defense's Cost Analysis Improvement Group, what someone there said years ago was the non-secret of good cost estimating was don't drink the Kool-Aid. And the reference there is to, kind of dating myself a little bit, in the 1970s, the Jim Jones committed mass suicide when he ordered everyone to drink the cyanide-laced Kool-Aid. So, yeah, don't drink the Kool-Aid the project managers are mixing up, because it's laced with optimism, and that leads to cost growth. We get the next slide here. Okay, here's some examples of extreme cost growth over time. The most recent one is the James Webb Space Telescope, which only launched, I think it was around Christmas of 2021. The next task is Next Generation Space Telescope. It is highly complex. It's a technical marvel, and we're learning a lot more about the universe than we're able to learn than with Hubble, which was an amazing satellite. But it cost over $10 billion, and it cost a couple of 2.5 decades to develop and launch. Some significant overruns. NASA originally had planned for it to cost about $1 billion. Management said we want a next generation space telescope for $1 billion. This is what we can allocate towards it. And the actual cost was $10 billion. If they had planned for it up front and had rigorous risk assessments up front, it likely would not have cost $10 billion. Wouldn't have been delayed as long. Another way to do it is to do it rather than trying to make this giant leap in one program, is to do it incrementally. There's a group that is famous for doing projects on time and relatively lower cost, called the Lockheed Skunk Works, and they're known for being efficient and doing things and being very productive. And one of their rules was only one miracle per program, and so that means there's only one new technological advancement per program. Well, James Webb had several different technological advancements in that one program, so it kind of broke that rule. Another one that you may not be familiar with is called MOSES, or in the Italian Mosè, which was a flood prevention project in the city of Venice. Familiar with Venice in Italy? They're kind of right on the sea, and there's lots of water right there, and they tend to have a lot of flooding. And as sea levels rise, the problem's getting worse over time. So over 20 years, they've been working on a project called MOSES to prevent floods, a series of gates and things that rise up. And it's taken so long to develop, it's already obsolete because the sea level forecast rise has increased. It does work to some extent. It takes into account and can protect against sort of average flooding, but not the more extreme floods. It has been a lot of scheduled delays and a lot of cost overruns. Some of it has had to do with public corruption and awarding contracts to people that get provided bribes to government officials. Another one is the California high-speed rail, designed to link Los Angeles and San Francisco. But the more recent plans, I don't know what the most current plan is for it, but when I was writing the book and the book published it, with the latest plan was just to link two cities in between, and those two cities, and it was not going to be a high-speed rail, going to be like an ordinary Amtrak type train, and it was going to parallel a highway, so you could almost get there. You wouldn't save much time by taking the train versus just driving between the two cities. The oldest one of these is the Sydney Opera House, which is a wonder of the world to some extent. Have you ever seen it? I've never been to Australia, but seen pictures of it. They began construction in the 1960s. It was basically there was a design contest, and the architect that won the design contest was sort of in charge of it at the beginning. They began the construction. They didn't have any detailed blueprints before they started building it. The architect, I think, was the project manager. It was a construction manager, and then he and the architect and the construction manager were kind of the co-leads. So there was no single unified chain of command. you with any kind of military experience, you know that unified chain of command, that's just a recipe for disaster, especially in the military, right? In the military, it gets people killed. So it can get people killed. So you need, so there's lots of things that went on there, and it was one of the highest cost increases, the longest schedule delays in history, like a 1,400% cost increase, and originally planned to be completed in 4 years, and it took 14 years before it was finished. And the bad news is cost growth. The worst news is in scheduling. The worst news is it's even worse than it looks, because if you look at the cost growth scheduling, the problems are worse. In economics, economists talk a lot about ceteris paribus, where they hold other things constant, but it doesn't really apply to you look at the cost overruns and schedule slope data. Many projects are descoped to mitigate these issues, and some are canceled outright. So, if you were to hold the technical performance constant, this data is even worse than it looks at first glance. Descope projects are told to achieve some objectives. So you might start out with 5 instruments on a satellite, and you wind up launching 3 or 2 or 1. But there are some projects that are just completely a waste because they never produce any. Well, they produce something, but then they just put them on the shelf. So the J2X rocket engine was part of the Constellation program. The Constellation program was canceled. They finished development of the J2X project thinking that they would use it on the upper stage of the Space Launch System that was a successor to Constellation and the shuttle program. But then they decided that the space shuttle main engines, RS-25s, were probably actually a better technical choice. And so they just put the J2X on the shelf. They completely finished it, tested it, made sure it worked great, but it just basically has never been used. Let's see. Okay, one of the things we can do if you look at cost growth and schedule delay history is you can actually calibrate your risk to it. So if you look at the cost growth data, which is the dashed black line, and then it's a little hard to tell on this graph because the cost growth data and the log normal are coincident. So the dotted gray line and the dashed cost growth line are right on top of each other. And if you try to fit what's called a Gaussian distribution to it, a normal distribution, not as good a fit. I like to say that when it comes to cost and schedule analysis, the normal is not so normal. And you see the same thing for the schedule growth data. Schedule growth on a percentage basis does not increase as much, right? So costs can increase by 1,000%. I've seen that happen. It happened for the Sydney Opera House. Depending on which benchmark you use for James Webb Space Telescope, it was maybe close to 1,000%. The initial cost estimates were not $1 billion, but the original NASA mandate was $1 billion. But so cost growth can grow, 500, 1,000%, sometimes more. Sydney Opera House for more than that. Schedule delay, you're not going to see 1,000% schedule delay because, for example, that would mean a 10-year project take 100 years. Well, something else would happen before then. You're not going to grow a schedule by 90 years, but you do see costs. You see schedules doubling and tripling, and things doubling and tripling in schedule. James Webb Space Telescope did that. And schedule growth also fits a log normal distribution very well. Log normal is a skewed distribution that is unlike the bell-shaped curve of the Gaussian. So the log normal incorporates the fact that there are more things that can go wrong than can go right. There's more risk than there are opportunities. More risk for cost growth than there are opportunities for savings. More risk for schedule delays than there are opportunities for doing things faster. Okay, so recent power outages in Texas. This was from a couple years ago, maybe 3 years ago. February 2021, so it's about 3 years ago. It was high impact. About 3 million people in Texas were without power in the winter storm in 2021. It's not likely, but it's not uncommon. Similar things happened in Texas in 2011, 10 years prior. Not nearly as widespread as the Northeast blackout in 2003, well, which was worse in a way. It affected 55 million people, but it happened during summer, so no one was really suffering too much. And these kinds of risks tend to follow what's called a power law. They have extremely heavy tails. There are some extreme risks that can happen. So it's calls this kind of power law. Littell follows the power law. So Even though you say, oh, well, this power outage in Texas was a black swan, not really. You could say, this, you can see this happening. Okay, and one thing I'll mention is risk is more than just looking at the past. Just because something has not happened doesn't mean it won't happen in the future. The narrative fallacy, which Nelson Taleb talks about in his books, including The Black Swan, is history is a good guide much of the time, can help us prepare for hazards. But when something surprising occurs, we usually invent a good reason for the fact why we should have expected it, right? So that's what happens with the guy is trying to figure out. So you see the little cartoon from Sergio Aragonés, who drew in the margins of Mad magazine years ago. You see the little cartoon there that the guy's trying to figure out which road sign to put up. He sees some rocks falling on his truck, and he says, "Okay, danger of rock falling is what danger of rock falling is what he put. That's kind of his narrative fallacy. That's what happened in the past. But looking forward, we live moving forward in time, but not backwards. So we can't avoid surprises, but we can be prepared by looking at weak links and sources of risk and preparing for potential bad events that have significant consequences. So when we do risk analysis, we tend to look at what's happened in the past, the bad things happened in the past, but we also, when we do risk management, need to look forward. Here's an example of that, the Ever Given. So this was, I think happened back in, was it 2022? 2021, 2022, maybe, 2021. So 50 ships pass through the Suez Canal each day, and that carries 12% of global trade. And the Ever Given, and you see on the ship there, it says Evergreen. The Evergreen Shipping Corporation makes a series of cargo ships, and they also make cargo containers. I've seen Evergreen cargo containers around here. They make shipping containers and shipping and cargo ships, and they give each one of their products a name called Ever something. In this case, that particular Evergreen ship was called the Ever Given, and Ever Given was stuck in the Suez Canal for a week. It was unlikely. 20,000 ships a year pass through the Suez Canal. There have been 75 incidences. So from 2011 to 2021, there were like 75 incidents. So less than one chance in 1,000, right? Like 3 chances or 4 chances in 10,000. There had never been an incident that completely blocked the canal or caused that level of disruption before. But the Suez Canal is a bottleneck. It's 120 miles long. Typical width is 200 to 300 feet. For most of the past, ships cannot pass one another. They have done some upgrades that they've completed not too long before this and widened the canal in certain areas, multi-billion-dollar upgrade, but this particular area was not part of that upgrade. But, forward thinking could have foreseen the potential for a significant disruption. When you have bottlenecks, you need contingencies. And that's not only the Suez Canal should prepare for that, but shipping companies should prepare for that as well. Okay. Types of risk. So these are the kinds of things that you might need to know. Sam, is types of risk. There's so cost growth is equal to the sum of cost estimating growth plus schedule technical growth. So schedule is kind of deliberately misspelled. Schedule technical growth plus requirements growth plus threat growth. And then cost risk is basically the same thing, but just replacing the word growth with risk. Remember, growth is the risks have been realized, right? So things grow when risks have occurred. Risk is a chance of something bad happening. Growth is when something bad has happened and it's affected cost. So cost estimating risk is risk due to cost estimating errors and the statistical uncertainty in the estimate. So you make mistakes in your cost estimate. You don't put the right inflation factors in or escalation factors in. You make a mistake in your estimate, and the fact that when you develop a cost model, it does not explain the past perfectly. There's some uncertainty. There's some noise in the data, and there's some noise in the future. So there's some uncertainty there. There is a schedule technical risk, your inability to conquer problems posed by the intended design. In the current CARD is a DoD term. The NASA equivalent is cadre. CARD is a cost analysis requirements description. And and for NASA folks, the cadre, the cadre is the cost and analysis requirements. Similar type of thing. Requirements risk is risk resulting from an as yet unseen design shift. current card or contract, arising to shortfalls in the documents. So, it's often the case, especially in the DoD, it's often the case that, especially for technologically advanced systems, where there's an ever-evolving threat, and so that causes requirements to change. And then there's threat risk. That's also the central thing. The problem changes, requirements change. We don't understand the design. We need to do something else. If you're familiar with, there was a project, there was a helicopter project 2 years ago. It was eventually finally canceled. I think it's called Comanche, and they had just a huge spiral of requirements upgrades that just killed it. Costs kept exploding, and because they kept changing the requirements. Oh, let's add this. We need to be able to do this. Okay, a little bit of review of statistics. You got to know a little bit of statistics to do risk analysis. Probability distributions are often represented by two parameters: a central tendency and a standard deviation. That's especially true for the normal distribution and the log normal distribution, which is the central tendency is an average, or the central moment, and then a standard deviation is kind of spread around that middle value. Three common measures of the central tendency are the mean, which is just the average. So if you have a set of n numbers, you add all the numbers together and divide by the number of numbers. If you have a continuous distribution, you have to take an integral. The median is the midpoint, so half are above, half are below. In the case you have an even number, so you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, then you have to take the average of the fourth and fifth values. The mode is the peak, or most likely value, the most commonly occurring value. So here's an example. I have these 7 numbers: 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, and 20. And the mean is the sum of those numbers, which is 42, divided by 7, that's 6. The median is the one in the middle. So this is it's 7 data points, right? So there's the 3 below are 1, 1, 2. The 3 above are 5, 10, 20. So the median is 3. And there are 2 1s. So that's the most common value. That's a 1. So your mode's a 1. So in a discrete set, the mode is just the one that occurs most often. So this example, the mode is smaller than the median, is less than the mean. And that's true for any kind of right-skewed data. We do see this data has a right skew to it. If you look at a log normal, so it's best depicted in the graph below, of right skew distributions, and this is basically a log normal distribution, because I developed this graph, the mode will be less than the median, and that will be less than the mean. And the mean is influenced by outliers. It is important in cost estimating to look at the mean, especially in a risk analysis context. When you look at data like income data, you tend to want to look at or net worth. You want to look at things like median, because it's more representative of actual people. Because people like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, their net worths are so tremendous that they kind of mess up the mean. The mean's kind of skewed upward because of them. So the variance for a sample is the sum of the squared deviations from the mean, and you divide by the degrees of freedom. And basically, you lose a degree of freedom in a sample, and so that's n minus 1. For a continuous probability, it's this integral. Standard deviation is the square root of the variance. So the standard deviation. So if you're looking at dollars, for example, then the mean would be in dollars, the variance would be in squared dollars, and the standard deviation would be in dollars. So sometimes people look at the standard deviation because it's the same units. That's what you're looking at. Squared dollars, looking at dollars. The coefficient of variation is the mean divided by the standard deviation. It's a measure of the relative amount of risk. Well, it's actually the other way around. So standard deviation, can we go ahead and type on this chart this long? It's standard deviation divided by the mean. It's the other way around. Standard deviation divided by the mean. So it gives you a measure of the relative amount of risk. So for example, if your standard deviation was 10 and your mean was 100, then your coefficient of variation is 10%, 0.1. If your mean is 100 and your standard deviation is 100, then your coefficient of variation is 1. So it allows you to compare things that are different sizes. So let's take another example. So if your mean was 100 and your standard deviation was 10, that's a 10%. But now suppose that your standard deviation is 1,000, but your mean is 10, it's 10 million. Well, you're still at 10%. So it's still a relative amount of risk, even though the standard deviation is quite a bit higher. Percentiles represent cumulative frequencies. For example, the 80th percentile is the point of the distribution. So let's say 80% of the distribution is less than or equal to that point. Cost, risk, and probability. Cost, risk, or cost uncertainty analysis represents cost as a probability distribution. Probability distribution is a mathematical rule associates a probability to each potential outcome or event of interest. So the two ways represented, and people tend to look at the CDF, which is called the cumulative distribution function, and we sometimes call that an S curve. In the graph that's there on the chart is the graph that's in green. It's called an S curve because it tends to look like an S. It's like an S shape. It's oftentimes it's easier to interpret, and so and this is a it's got two different axes, one for the PDF, one for the CDF. The PDF, the axis there is the 0.0002 and the 0.0004 and so on. And that's for the PDF. It's a little hard to interpret. What does that mean? But the CDF tells you, okay, we got a confidence level. Now, confidence level it is not to be confused with a confidence interval from statistics class. It is something that is peculiar to cost estimating. It's a term. It's a cost estimating term, kind of the jargon of cost estimating, kind of sort of a nickname for the percentile. So confidence level is a percentile. So if I look at something and I say, okay, the 50th percent confidence level is, say, 500 million. I kind of the chart, it's more than 500 million. Let's just say it's 500 million. Then there's a 50% chance that the final cost of the project will come in below that amount, and a 50% chance it'll come in above that amount. That's what we mean by confidence level. Okay, uncertainty is a shape. So we tend to look at averages. So averages can be very misleading. So if you were to look at averages, for example, it would tell you that Nashville is rainier than Seattle, because Nashville gets about a little bit less than 50 inches of rain a year, and Seattle gets a little less than 40 inches of rain a year. So by that reckoning, you'd say, okay, Nashville is rainier than Seattle. But if you've been to, you know about Seattle, or what Seattle's reputation is, it's kind of cloudy and rainy. Think of cloudy, rainy. That's where Starbucks started, right? That's where grunge came from in the 90s. If you don't remember that. But you think about rainy weather, and so if you just look at the averages, you say, well, the average rain per day in Nashville is more than the average rain per day in Seattle. It's a little bit misleading. If you actually look at the number of rainy days, it's quite a bit different. And the only 2 months in which which Nashville has more rainy days than Seattle is like July and August, and it's still only about a third of the time. So it's really not looking at the averages can be misleading. So you need to look at the overall shape of the distribution. You need to look at the entire shape of the distribution to really understand what's going on. And uncertainty is a shape. And so 4 commonly used probability distributions are the Gaussian, the normal. If you've taken statistics class, you've encountered this. Lots of things are based on that, but it's not applicable to cost and schedule because of skew and what are called fat tails or heavy tails, which is a possibility of extreme events, especially extreme bad events. The triangular is often used. It's very simple to deal with. It's easy to get and solicit that from an expert and say, okay, what's the worst it can be? What's the best it can be? What's its most likely value, especially for inputs? It's not too bad for inputs, but it's still too simple. It can only model limited range. But if you're looking at an input to your cost model, such as weight, maximum power, that kind of thing, it may not be a bad idea to do something like that. The log normal is better in many instances. It can model skew. It can model relatively fat tails. It's kind of in between thin tails and fat tails. And then if you think of the normal distribution as being like a solid, and then real extreme heavy tails distribution as being a liquid. You can kind of think of the log normal as being kind of like Jello, kind of in between. Then there's the Pareto, which is the extreme power tails, used on extreme risk, 80-20 rule, 80%. So the 80-20 rule is, like 80% of the work is done by 20% of the workforce, that kind of thing. Those sorts of things, or 80% of the problems are caused by 20% of the employees. So that's 80-20 rule, and it's used to model extreme events. And so adjusted gross income in the United States tends to follow that kind of rule. Okay, quantitative risk and summing point estimates. So how do you, so one of the important things about adding risks, right? So it's important that you incorporate the uncertainty when you add together these things. So there's 6 WBS elements here that have these variety of distributions here. Most of them are log normal to some extent. A couple of them are triangular. It's a mix of triangular and log normal. The parameters are provided in the table here on the right. There's the mean and standard deviations. And then for the triangular distributions, you don't parameterize those with the mean and standard deviation directly. You use a low, a most likely, and a high. That's the L, the M, and the H. And SD in this case stands for standard deviation. And in our distribution, LN is log normal and tri is triangular. And I'm going to correlate all these at 0.6, 60%. And there are point estimates for these, which are 90, 50, 20, 40, 70, 30. The sum of those values is 300. So my best estimate for each one of those is given there. The sum of those best estimates is 300. What is the confidence level of the sum of the most likely values? Just kind of to add those. Well, this leads to, it turns out it's actually pretty low, like around 20%. So this leads us to aggregating risk across the BBS. So it turns out that if you just summing point estimates, you are your best single value, you're going to way underestimate the total cost.
Please try again. Please enter the second number from the following numbers: 2, 6, 6.
And we're getting some background.
Review transaction history. Reset your PIN and
it's background noise. Okay, thank you. All right. So if we want to determine the 70th percentile, the overall cost distribution, how do we get that? We can't simply add the 70th percentiles of each of the cost risk distributions. We can add means and variances, but so you can add the means, you can add the variance. That's the formulas for doing that. Take into account correlation, which is given by the Greek letter rho, which looks like a P, this kind of italicized P. And so when you do risk analysis, multiple risks are added together. They have different probability distributions. The most common way this is done is Monte Carlo simulation. There are different ways to do that in Excel. There's some Excel add-ins, crystal ball, at risk. Many of us now, you can do this, and you can use R. You can do it in Python. You can take the inputs and then do it offline. There are different ways of doing it. I moved away from doing at risk and crystal ball. I tend to do my own simulations. Correlation and causation. Note that correlation is not causation, but however, causation can imply some kind of correlation. For example, shark attacks and ice cream sales at the beach. Those two things are correlated. Shark attacks do not cause ice cream sales to increase or decrease, and vice versa. But what happens is there's an underlying cause, that there's an underlying structure, which is that there are more people at the beach in the summer, and so there are more potential shark attack victims, and there are more potential customers for ice cream sales. There's a correlation there, but not a causation. So a launch vehicle structure, increasing the diameter of the launch vehicle will increase the structure's cost. It will also result in higher costs for thermal coatings, such as paint. And just because two subsystems do not appear to be related does not mean they're not correlated. So, for example, structures and computer equipment, avionics, for example, seemingly have little relation to one another. However, an external factor such as a funding cut or a strike will impact all subsystems because you have a schedule delay, and that will impact everything across the board. So everything in WBS has some correlation. I would argue that some positive correlation. This is a chart from Steve Book, who looked at, okay, well, if we assume that the correlation is 0, but it's really some other value given by the graph, how much are we underestimating the total amount of risk as measured by this standard deviation? So if you have a 30 element WBS, that's the blue graph on this line. If you move up the graph, okay, say, okay, well, up here, actual correlation is 0.2. It's on the x-axis. I go up to the blue line, so 30 WBS elements. I go over to the y-axis, and I get a 60. That's the percent I'm underestimating the total standard deviation. So I'm by assuming 0 correlation, even when the correlation is relatively low between all the elements, say 20% in the 30 element WBS, I'm underestimating the total amount of risk by 60% by assuming there's no correlation. So that's kind of, And this is, you know, one of the motivating things in Steve Book's presentation, which is why correlation matters in cost estimating, which he presented in, I think, 1999. Okay, so that's what we kind of just went through. And one of the things that he recommended is without, you know, a better value, that 20% would kind of get you, if you assume 20%, it would kind of get you pretty far up the curve. So that would be better, it's better than nothing. This is 20%. But the 20% near the curve has some drawbacks. It's better than assuming independence, but has some drawbacks. If you want to be a little bit more robust, you want to minimize how wrong you can be when you assume a value, given the fact that we probably are wrong in a specific value. But when you assume it's 20%, then you know you're going to be more wrong than if you assume it's 60%. And if you assume 60%, you're going to be less wrong on average overall. So that's why I propose a 60% default value for correlation across the board. Okay, now that's not necessarily something you need to know for the exam, but it's just you need to understand that correlation is important. And if you ignore it, you're going to underestimate the total amount of risk. That's the kind of thing that can be on the exam. Functional correlations, you have two elements are directly related in estimating equations. So for example, if you have system SE/PM, that's systems engineering and program management. And that's this equation, it is 50% of the system hardware cost. So if you do a simulation and you have variances in the hardware costs, and you sum those up, and then you multiply by 0.5, and you do a simulation, you're going to automatically get uncertainty in your system engineering and program management. So you don't need to put uncertainty, put uncertainty on top of that. You know, they're automatically correlated. You don't need to put correlation on top of that. You don't need what we call injection correlation, because they're already correlated. There's a linear relationship between them. They're actually 100% correlated. The method of moments, which is basically adding means and variances, that uses only injection correlation. That's where you have to assign the correlation matrix. Measures of correlation. There's two different measures of correlations that are commonly used: Pearson's product moment correlation and Spearman's rank correlation. If you look at a tool like At-Risk Crystal Ball, they use Spearman's rank correlation because it's easier program, and that's the nuts and bolts of it. It's harder to do Pearson product moment correlation. You can do Pearson product moment correlation. There's algorithms out there that published. You can do it in an Excel spreadsheet, but it's a little bit more complicated. But you should try to do Pearson's product moment correlation. Risk Plus use Pearson product moment correlation, but it's really no longer around. Pearson correlation looks at the linearity measure of how close are these two variables to a linear relationship. So, for example, negative correlation sloping downward, positive correlation sloping upward. No correlation is just a scatter shot. There's no kind of eyeball it. So there's really no trend between the two. Okay, so now as we look back and we go back and we revisit our problem go back and look at our problem, and we look at, okay, we add to those individual best estimates. In this case, we're adding the 50% confidence level estimate to the 50% confidence level for each WBS, and we were to aggregate that and do a risk analysis, we would get an S curve that's given there in the little graph, and we would see that the 300, which was the sum of all those best estimates, is only at the 20% confidence level. So just adding the best estimates is not good. It significantly underestimates cost and schedule. So I call that a point estimate, even though it's a 50% confidence. Single best estimate of cost. Aggregating point estimates significantly underestimates cost and schedule. So don't do that. You need to do a full up quantitative risk analysis, either with simulation or method of moments. And then I guess my other points that are on here. So the funding point estimates are really pointless. So you have a low confidence level funding for the system. Anytime you fund, and this is why you need to look at the mean and cost estimates, because anytime you fund below the mean, in this case, you're funding the 50th percentile, which is below the mean, because remember, these things are skewed. And in that case, the mode is less than the median is less than the mean. Remember that? We talked about that before. So whenever you do that, you start aggregating these values, start adding these values, you're going to go to a lower confidence level. I looked at that years ago. I looked at that for a portfolio of 8 projects where we'd done risk analysis, and each one had been funded to a 50% confidence level. And I looked at what is the overall confidence level for the entire portfolio, and it was 36%. So just that one act, you're increasing your risk and likely that you're not going to be able to afford your portfolio. So as a result of that, I was able to convince my leadership to start funding to the mean instead and make that change. So this connection with portfolio analysis, as with WBS, you fund individual projects below the mean, you get a negative portfolio effect. So the total organization is riskier than the individual projects. That's not what you want to have. You want to have the opposite be the case, right? You want to be able to fund in such a way that when you look at the overall portfolio, it's not as risky as the single riskiest project. You want diversification. Like you go out and you buy stock. You don't just go out and buy. Well, maybe you might be doing this. I don't know. You might just somebody might be doing this. You might be going out and buying all NVIDIA stock, for example, which has been going up and up and up a lot lately, right? But hopefully you're diversifying, right? So you might have some NVIDIA stock, maybe you have some Pepsi stock or something, and so that when NVIDIA has a stumble, your portfolio doesn't just go in the toilet, right? So, and we talked about this earlier about the S curves. This tend to display cost risk. S curves they're easy to understand. They're especially good for communicating to management. Okay, confidence levels. So we talked about the probability distribution. So in this case, like 100, in this case, 120 is at the 80th percentile. 80% confidence level means there's an 80% chance that the total cost will come in at or below that amount. Here's an example of the normal distribution. So the mean is 100 and the standard deviation is 20. The median, because it's a bell curve, it's symmetric. The median, the mode are also 100. 80th percentile is 117. So that's just an example there. Okay, and then I want to close with projects. Kind of wrap this up with projects are inherently risky. Projects of all kinds experience regular amounts of significant cost and schedule growth. It's evidence not only of risk but lack of proper risk management. Unfortunately, risk is often considered to be another four-letter word. We need to do quantitative risk assessment of projects. But the application of quantitative methods has a lot of obstacles. And I address these in my book that was published in 2020. You can download chapter 1 for free. I don't know if that tiny URL is still working anymore. Be careful about tiny URLs. They change over time. But you can look at Amazon.com, and if you're interested, I can send you chapter 1 for free. Better way to do it. One of the things that can be done, three keys to success. One of the things is that's been said over time is if you continue to do the same thing over and over again, you're going to get the same result. If you want to do get a different result, you should do things differently. And so to be more successful, projects need to do things more different. They need to do things differently. One is recognize the problem. Recognize that lack of planning for risk hinders project success. Don't plan for the best case. Realize you're prone to biases such as optimism. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. Look for independent critical input. So this applies to everything. Your work as a cost estimator, even in your personal life. If you're getting a kitchen remodeling done, for example, you get a bid from a contractor that says it's going to cost $10,000. He's probably lowballing you. It's probably much higher than that now. If he even says $50,000, it's probably going to cost more than that. 2, measure risk more accurately. Recognize risk is underestimated, especially early in planning. We need to do quantitative risk measurement. If you just look at a matrix, which projects often look at a matrix of, and look at things qualitatively, what are the specific discrete risks that can occur, how likely they are, what's the potential consequence. We need to look at more than that. We need to look at measures such as calibration, such as looking to history and historical cost growth and schedule growth, which very closely follow a log normal distribution. That will help ensure realism. And measure risk coherently. I haven't talked about this in this presentation because this is mainly aimed at training, but just looking at confidence levels has its own issues instead of risk measures. There are better risk measures than that. If you attended recently, the Great Alabama chapter had a meeting, I think, and Louis Fussell presented on alternative risk measures. He talks about that in there, and I talk about that in my book some too. And then 3, manage risk effectively. You know, you need to manage risk, not just measure it. You need to measure risk in a way to address significant growth. Look at risk at the portfolio level and assess the impact of potential new emissions over a long time frame and think strategically. So, write things that need to be done to be done better. And then I want to close with this urban legend. So this urban legend from NASA is an urban legend, which was repeated in a really good book about, I think it's called Bad Buying, but it's really an urban legend. It was presented as fact, has been presented as fact, but it's really not true. But this is the urban legend. NASA spent millions of dollars to design a pen to write in a low gravity environment, while the Russian cosmonauts used grease pencil. Not really true. And they didn't really use pencils. They didn't use graphite pencils. They used grease pencils. You know, the story is that the NASA astronaut said, "Hey, look at our fancy space pens," and the Russians said, "Oh yeah, that's great. We use pencils." Well, they don't tend to use graphite pencils because pencils are flammable, and you know, NASA learned the hard way from Apollo 1 to avoid flammable environments. Um, but it turned out that actually that the Fisher Space Pen Company, the Fisher Pen Company, used their own uh, research and development dollars to develop a pen that could write in low gravity environments and also could write underwater. And then they sold them to NASA and to Russia. But before that, both NASA and Russia, astronauts and cosmonauts, they both used grease pencils, and they've also used the Fisher space pens. So it's not really true, but it does give you a valuable lesson. Risk management entails looking at the outcome you want to achieve and finding the best way to achieve it, which could include a low risk way. Why go out and develop a space pen if you can use a grease pencil? There's no risk involved. It's not flammable. It costs no money, and you know there's no risk in the development of it. So you know, you want to look at the context. So the heart of risk management is understanding the context, and it's not about avoiding risk, but understanding it in order to maximize odds of success. Okay, some further reading. There's a cost estimating volume knowledge 2.0. Some of my papers on risk analysis have been collected at the ICEAA website there, ICEAonline.com/publication/solving-PRM. You can see my book as well. And then Paul Garvey has a really excellent book on probability methods for cost uncertainty analysis. His first edition was the 2000 version, and then the more recent edition of 2016. It adds on some other things, but if you just really want to look at, it was co-authored by Steve Book and Ray Covert. But if you really want to just look at cost uncertainty analysis, it's good just to look at his original first edition. And then David Hewlett, if you want to learn more about how to do schedule risk analysis, I recommend look at David Hewlett's book for a practical guide to that. So those are, Garvey's book is good for the nuts and bolts of cost uncertainty, cost risk analysis, and David Hewlett is good for the nuts and bolts of schedule risk analysis. Okay, and with that, I'm going to see if you have any questions or comments. And to overwhelm you with material. I'm going to stop recording.